I was standing at gate 42, seconds away from boarding, when a woman I had never seen before grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my skin, her eyes wide and shaking with tears. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "Don't get on flight 237. I'm begging you." For a moment, everything around me went silent. The sounds of rolling suitcases and boarding announcements faded. I could only see her face, pale, desperate, terrified. I pulled my arm free, trying to make sense of what just happened. "I don't even know you," I said, stepping back. But she didn't move. She just kept crying. People were starting to stare. A security guard was already walking over. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. She whispered one last time, barely audible, "If you get on that plane, you'll regret it." I shook my head, turned away, and walked toward the gate. I thought she was just another unstable traveler. I wish I had listened. 3 hours later, I realized she wasn't crazy at all. Subscribe if you love true life mystery stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. That morning started like any other travel day. My name's Jessica Rowan. I'm 32, and I work as a travel nurse. I was flying from Denver to Seattle for a medical conference. Nothing dramatic, just another quick trip. The airport was busy but calm. The smell of coffee filled the air. People rushed past, and I scrolled through my phone waiting for my gate to open. I was a little tired from a long shift the night before, but mostly I was excited. My younger brother Ryan, who's a pilot in Seattle, promised to meet me for dinner after the conference. He called just as I was checking the boarding time. "Hey Jess," he said, "you sure you're on flight 237? I heard there's been some turbulence warnings on that route." I laughed. "I'll be fine, Captain Safety. It's just a short flight. Promise me you'll text when you land," he said. "I promise," I told him, smiling. Ryan has always been protective, ever since we were kids. He's the kind of person who checks the locks twice and still worries they're open, but that's part of who he is. Before hanging up, he said, "Don't ignore your gut, okay?" I told him I never do, but that wasn't true. Not that day. I grabbed a sandwich, found a seat by the window, and watched planes lift into the cloudy sky. Everything felt normal, predictable, safe. I had no idea that within the hour, a stranger would try to stop me from getting on that plane, and that her warning would haunt me forever. If you're hooked already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. The first time I noticed her, she was standing alone near the big windows across from my gate. She looked out of place, like she didn't belong in the crowd. Everyone else was glued to their phones, sipping coffee or scrolling through flight updates. But she just stood there, clutching something tightly in her hands. At first, I thought it was a passport or a boarding pass, but when she turned, I saw it was a small photograph. Her fingers were shaking as she stared at it, her lips moving like she was whispering to herself. Something about her made me uneasy, but not in a threatening way. She looked more broken than dangerous, like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was messy, her clothes wrinkled, and her eyes red and puffy from crying. I looked away, telling myself not to stare. Airports are full of emotional people. Maybe she'd just said goodbye to someone she loved. A few minutes later, the loudspeaker announced boarding for flight 237. I stood, grabbed my bag, and joined the line. That's when I heard quick footsteps behind me. Before I could turn, someone grabbed my arm hard enough to make me drop my phone. It was her. "Please," she said, her voice trembling so badly I could barely understand her. "You're on flight 237, right?" I pulled my arm back, trying to stay calm. "Yeah, what's this about?" Her eyes widened even more. "Don't get on that plane. I'm begging you." People around us started turning to look. A man behind me muttered, "What's going on?" And someone else said, "Security!" My heart raced, but not because I believed her. It was the embarrassment, the confusion, the sheer weirdness of it all. "I don't even know you," I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. "What are you talking about?" Her hands were trembling, clutching that photo so tight the edges were crumpling. They shouldn't have let it fly again. "It's not safe. Please listen to me. If you get on flight 237, you'll die." For a second, her words hit me like a punch to the chest. My logical brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe she was mixing me up with someone else. Maybe she had a loved one on this flight who died before. A security guard finally came over, stepping between us. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," he said firmly. "You're upsetting people." She shook her head, tears spilling down her face. "You don't understand. They covered it up. That flight shouldn't even exist." The guard took her by the arm gently but firmly, starting to lead her away. She kept crying, calling out over her shoulder, "Please, don't board. You'll regret it." Everyone was staring at me now. I felt a mix of pity and discomfort. I bent down to pick up my phone, trying to ignore the stares. My hands were shaking a little, though I didn't want to admit it. A woman behind me whispered, "Poor thing, probably having a breakdown." A man near the gate agent laughed nervously and said, "Guess every airport has its drama." I forced a weak smile, pretending it didn't bother me. But deep down, it did. When the line started moving again, I noticed something on the floor near where the woman had been standing. A small photograph. I picked it up automatically, thinking I'd hand it to security. But when I looked closer, my stomach tightened. It was a picture of a man in a pilot's uniform, smiling with his arm around the same woman who'd just grabbed me. His name tag read, Captain D. Miles, Flight 237. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My pulse hammered in my ears. The woman wasn't just some random stranger. She had a personal connection to this flight. I tried to convince myself it was just coincidence. Maybe he'd been her husband and something bad happened years ago, and she never got over it. People carry grief in strange ways. But the way she'd looked at me, the desperation in her voice, it didn't feel like grief. It felt like fear. Still, I told myself there was no way any of this was real. The airport was secure. Planes go through checks every day. I was being ridiculous. I slid the photo into my jacket pocket, telling myself I'd hand it in when I landed. As the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, I glanced toward the hallway where security had taken her. She was gone. The space felt colder somehow, heavier. I took a deep breath, adjusted my bag on my shoulder, and stepped forward toward the gate. Maybe she was crazy. Maybe it was all in her head. But as I scanned my boarding pass and walked down the jet bridge, one thought wouldn't leave me. What if she was right? As the line inched forward, I tried to steady my breathing. My arms still tingled where the woman had grabbed me, but I forced myself to shake it off. People were boarding calmly, chatting, scrolling on their phones. No one else seemed worried. I told myself that if something was truly wrong, security would have grounded the flight already. The woman had probably mistaken me for someone else, or maybe she was dealing with grief she couldn't let go of. When I stepped through the gate, a wave of warm air hit me. The smell of coffee and recycled air filled the jet bridge. It should have felt routine. I'd boarded hundreds of flights before, but this time my steps felt heavier, like the floor was testing every ounce of my decision. I kept replaying her voice in my head. "You'll regret it." Inside the plane, I smiled weakly at the flight attendant greeting passengers. Her name tag read Kara, and she looked cheerful and calm, the kind of person who made you feel safe even when you weren't. I found my seat, 17A by the window. A gray sky stretched outside, the kind that made the airport lights glow orange. I tried to distract myself by texting Ryan. "Jessica, boarding now. Guess who's nervous?" Ryan, "Not you, the fearless nurse? What's wrong?" Jessica, "Just something weird at the gate. I'll tell you later. Love you." I slipped my phone into airplane mode and tried to laugh it off. The woman had clearly been unstable. Still, my hand brushed the inside of my jacket pocket where I had tucked her photo. I could feel its edges, folded slightly, pressing against the fabric. The man in the pilot's uniform, his smile, the name, Captain D. Miles. I looked up as the pilot's voice came through the speaker. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain, David Miles. We're expecting a smooth flight to Seattle today with just a little turbulence on the way." My heart stopped for a second. The name, the same one on the photograph. My fingers tightened around the armrest as the passengers around me went on buckling their seatbelts, unaware. It had to be coincidence. There could be hundreds of people with that name. I tried to convince myself, but the more I thought about it, the less it felt random. The man sitting next to me was older, maybe in his 70s, with a kind face and a soft smile. "First time flying this route?" he asked. No," I said, forcing a grin. "I travel for work." "Good for you," he said. "You look like someone who's got it together. I, on the other hand, always get nervous before takeoff." I laughed politely, though my stomach was twisting. "I guess I'm just distracted today." He nodded knowingly. "Maybe it's intuition. Don't ignore it." The engines started humming, and the plane began backing away from the gate. I felt that familiar vibration under my feet, the one that usually calmed me. This time it didn't. Every sound felt louder. Every announcement, every seatbelt click made my chest tighten a little more. The safety demonstration played. I barely heard a word. My eyes stayed fixed on the cockpit door, the one that separated us from Captain Miles. The name echoed in my mind again and again. As the plane picked up speed on the runway, I caught a reflection of my face in the window. I looked calm on the outside, but inside, my thoughts were spinning. What if Hannah Miles, if that was really her name, had been warning me about her husband? What if something was wrong with him? We lifted off the ground, and the airport grew smaller beneath us. The moment we broke through the clouds, the plane jolted suddenly. A few passengers gasped, and a drink cart rattled in the aisle. The seatbelt sign chimed. The old man next to me chuckled nervously. "Guess we hit that turbulence they mentioned." I nodded, trying to smile, but my pulse wouldn't slow down. The flight attendants stayed calm, moving through the aisles as if nothing unusual had happened. But I noticed something. The captain's voice hadn't come back on. Usually they'd say something reassuring after a rough takeoff. This time, silence. I leaned back in my seat, staring at the folded napkin in my lap, wondering if I was overreacting. The woman's words had crawled under my skin like a splinter I couldn't pull out. For the next hour, I tried reading, sleeping, anything to distract myself. Every time the plane shook, I jumped. Every time I heard footsteps near the cockpit, my heart leapt. At one point, the old man beside me offered me a stick of gum. "Helps with the nerves," he said kindly. I thanked him and forced a laugh. Halfway through the flight, I felt a strange calm settle in. The clouds outside were bright white against a blue sky, and for the first time, I began to believe it was all going to be fine. I even thought about what I'd say to Ryan later, how I'd tell him about the crying woman and her warning, how ridiculous it had sounded. But that peace didn't last long. About 2 hours in, the pilot's voice returned, slightly shaky. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a small issue in the cockpit, but everything is under control." The cabin went quiet. I turned to the man beside me, and his eyes met mine, wide and uncertain. My heart pounded. My hand went to my jacket pocket. I could feel the photo again, warm from my body heat. The woman's face flashed in my mind, her desperate voice, her shaking hands. And for the first time since boarding, I started to believe she might have been right. 3 hours into the flight, the calm I'd been trying to hold on to finally started to unravel. I had stopped checking the clock, but I could feel the time in my body, the stiffness in my neck, the dry air making it hard to breathe, the low hum of the engines that had started to sound uneven. The old man next to me had fallen asleep with his arms crossed, his head tilted back, snoring softly. I was half dozing myself when the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," the pilot's voice said a little too quickly, "we're going to make a short diversion due to an onboard medical situation. Please remain seated." The cabin filled with murmurs. People shifted, looking around. I turned and saw a flight attendant running down the aisle, followed by another pushing a medical kit. 2 rows ahead, a man had collapsed onto his tray table. His wife was crying, shouting his name. Instinct kicked in before I even thought about it. I unclipped my seatbelt, stood, and hurried over. "I'm a nurse," I said, kneeling beside the man. "Let me help." The attendants moved aside instantly. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow. I checked for a pulse. Weak, but there. "Sir, can you hear me?" I said firmly, tapping his shoulder. No response. His wife's hands shook as she tried to explain. He just grabbed his chest and stopped breathing right after the bump. I started CPR, counting out compressions in my head. One of the attendants handed me a portable oxygen mask. "We've contacted the cockpit. she said. "We're descending to Boise." "Good," I said without looking up. "Keep him stable." It felt like forever, but after a minute the man gasped. The entire row exhaled at once, and his wife sobbed in relief. I adjusted his head and kept checking his breathing. "He's stable for now," I said quietly. "He needs a hospital as soon as possible." When I finally sat back down, my heart was still racing. I turned toward the window to steady myself, but then I noticed something strange. The cockpit door was open slightly, and I could see two figures moving inside. One of them was the pilot, Captain Miles. He stepped out for a moment, his face pale, his shirt soaked with sweat. He was breathing hard, like someone who'd run a mile. The co-pilot whispered something to him that I couldn't catch, but I heard his answer clearly. "It's happening again," he said. My blood ran cold. Again? What did that mean? He rubbed his forehead and looked down the aisle for a moment. His eyes scanned the passengers before locking on something, or someone. I ducked slightly, pretending to look at my phone, but I could still see his face. He looked terrified, not focused, not professional, terrified. A few minutes later, the captain went back into the cockpit, and the door closed. I turned to the flight attendant who had been sitting near the jump seat. "Is everything okay?" I asked quietly. She smiled tightly. "Just routine. The captain's fine." But her voice cracked on the last word, and I could tell she didn't believe it either. The plane began descending faster than usual. The change in pressure made my ears pop painfully. I glanced out the window and saw the landscape growing clearer, the patchwork of farms and roads under a blanket of clouds. The descent felt steeper, shakier. Then came the sharpest jolt yet. The oxygen masks dropped. Screams filled the cabin. My seatbelt pulled against my chest as the plane tilted. For one horrible second, I thought we were going down. Then, just as suddenly, we leveled out. The engines steadied. The captain's voice came through again, shaky but controlled. "Apologies for the turbulence, folks. We're landing now. Please stay seated." When we touched down, the wheels hit the runway so hard it felt like the plane might split in half. People clapped out of relief, but I couldn't. Something still felt wrong. The moment we stopped, I saw flashing lights outside, police cars, ambulances, and even black SUVs. The door opened, and uniformed officers came aboard immediately. They didn't rush to the sick passenger. They went straight to the cockpit. The captain stepped out with his hands shaking. His eyes darted around as if looking for someone. When two officers approached, he said something I couldn't hear. Then, louder, as they grabbed his arms, he shouted, "I didn't mean to! I didn't know she'd warned them!" My stomach dropped. The officers cuffed him and led him off the plane. The passengers whispered, confused and frightened. The co-pilot came on the intercom, trying to calm everyone, saying, "Everything is under control. Please remain seated until instructed to exit." But it wasn't under control. As we were escorted off, I finally understood what had been happening. On the news later, I learned the truth. The captain, David Miles, had been under investigation for a crash 3 years earlier, one that had killed dozens. It had been ruled pilot error, but the airline had quietly let him return to duty while the case dragged on. His wife, Hannah Miles, had protested, claiming he was mentally unfit and suffering from breakdowns and hallucinations after the crash. No one had listened. That morning, when she saw Flight 237 assigned to her husband again, she drove to the airport to stop him, convinced history would repeat itself. And she had been right, in a way. The system's malfunction that happened mid-air could have turned deadly if not for the emergency landing. We were lucky. In the chaos, I remembered the photo I still had in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at their faces, hers full of fear, his full of pride. 3 hours earlier, I thought she was crazy. Now I realized she was the reason I was still alive. When I finally stepped off that plane, the world outside felt unreal. The bright lights on the tarmac were blinding, reflecting off the wet pavement. Emergency vehicles surrounded us, their sirens low but constant, like the echo of something that had almost gone terribly wrong. Passengers huddled in small groups, some crying, others just staring blankly into the distance, trying to process what had happened. My hands were still trembling, and the photo I'd found, her photo, was still in my pocket, its edges damp from my grip. A paramedic came over to check on me, but I waved him off gently. "I'm fine," I said, though the words didn't feel true. Inside, I was shaking, not from fear of flying or from what happened on the plane, but from the thought that everything could have ended differently if not for that stranger, Hannah Miles. I couldn't stop thinking about her. She'd risked everything to warn me, a total stranger, and I had ignored her. When I got inside the terminal, the air was thick with voices. Police officers were talking to crew members, reporters were already calling for statements, and passengers were trying to contact family. I found a quiet corner and pulled out my phone. The first thing I did was call Ryan. He answered on the second ring. "Jess, oh my God, are you okay? I just saw something about Flight 237 being diverted. What happened?" My throat tightened. "I'm okay," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "We had a problem on the plane. We landed in Boise instead of Seattle." "What kind of problem?" he asked. I looked down at the photo in my hand, tracing the faces with my thumb. "The pilot," I whispered. "It was him. The woman at the gate. She was his wife. She tried to warn me." Ryan was silent for a moment, and then he said softly, "Jess, you're lucky." "I know," I said, "but she's the one who saved me, not luck." After hanging up, I sat there for a long time, just watching people move around me. Everything felt slower, heavier. I used to believe that life was made up of choices, logic, and timing. I believed in control, but that day had shown me something else. How sometimes the line between reason and instinct blurs, and how ignoring that quiet voice inside you can almost cost you everything. The next day, the story was everywhere. News outlets reported that Captain David Miles had been arrested after the emergency landing. He was being charged for flying without full medical clearance and for covering up past psychological issues. The airline released a statement calling it a tragic lapse in communication. They didn't mention his wife at all, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. I searched her name online and found an old article about the crash 3 years earlier. It mentioned that she had lost her son in that accident. That was the detail that broke me. Her husband had been the pilot, and her child had been on board. Since then, she'd been in and out of treatment for trauma. People labeled her unstable. But now I knew. She wasn't crazy. She was carrying the kind of pain that makes you see danger before anyone else can. A week later, I decided to visit her. It took some effort to find the psychiatric facility where she was staying, a quiet, tree-lined building outside of Denver. When I walked in, the nurse looked surprised but kind. "She doesn't get many visitors," she said, leading me down a long hallway that smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender. Hannah was sitting by a window, dressed in a pale blue sweater, her eyes distant. When she saw me, she frowned slightly, like she was trying to remember where she knew me from. I took a deep breath and said, "You tried to warn me about Flight 237. Her eyes filled with tears. "You got on the plane," she whispered. "I did," I admitted, my voice shaking. "But we landed safely. You saved us." She stared at me for a long time before whispering, "No one believed me." "I do," I said quietly. "I believe you." I reached into my bag and handed her the photo I'd kept. She took it carefully, her hands trembling, and stared at it like it was something sacred. "I thought it was lost," she said, her voice barely a breath. "I found it," I told her, "and I think it found me for a reason." We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, and the sky was clear and calm, the kind of peace I hadn't felt since that day at the airport. Before leaving, I slipped a small note beside her chair. It said only 4 words. "You were right. Thank you." When I walked out, I felt lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because I finally understood. Sometimes life sends you warnings in ways that make no sense. Sometimes the person you think is broken is the one holding the truth. That night, as I packed my suitcase to finally head home, I stopped by the window of my hotel room. Planes glided through the night sky in the distance, blinking lights moving in steady rhythm. I used to love flying for the sense of control, the structure of it. Now I respected it differently. I understood how fragile that trust really was, and how much faith it takes to keep stepping forward. I'll never forget her face, her voice, or the way she said, "Please don't board." I didn't listen that day, but I will for the rest of my life. And if there's one thing I learned, it's this. Never be too quick to dismiss someone who's begging you to listen. Their warning might just be the reason you live to tell the story. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more true life stories and comment below where you're watching from. It helps our community grow and keeps these stories alive.